Welcome back to the Prophets of IT, the podcast where we sit down with the smartest people in the IT channel to pull out the insights that actually move the needle. I'm your host, Jim Punzenberger, founder and creator of ManagedProspectingSystem.com and author of $0 Advertising Strategies. A quick word from our sponsor before we begin. ManagedProspectingSystem.com is a proven three-pillar system that helps IT companies with 1 to 10 employees generate predictable leads through authority content, LinkedIn outreach, and targeted email campaigns. If you're done hoping and praying with referrals and you're ready for a real pipeline, time to head to ManagedProspectingSystem.com. All right, today's guest is somebody who thinks about technology differently than most people I talk to. He's CEO of Tangonet Tangonet. I can't pronounce things today. Tangonet Solutions. Did I even pronounce that right on like the 17th time?
That's fine, Jim. Yeah, Tangonet Solutions.
Tangonet Solutions, the company that bridges the U.S. and Argentina to build Nearshore and Nearshore engineering teams. He helps companies move AI from pilot projects to production systems. He's launching a product called Redbird AI that uses artificial intelligence for traffic monitoring and infraction detection, and has been keeping handwriting journals for over a decade. That's thousands of pages. Dennis, welcome to Prophets of IT.
Thank you, Jim. Pleasure to be here.
So, Dennis, this is your great riff you chose here for your walk-up song, Won't Get Fooled Again by The Who. And I guess you just mentioned that it's significant to you because the Won't Get Fooled Again really resonates with you.
Yeah, because as I mentioned to you, Jim, every time I get fooled, I say, well, that won't happen again, but it does happen again. So it's an interesting twist on the song, but yeah, in technology and in other aspects of life, sometimes you get fooled. Like the pandemic fooled me, for example. I really thought our business was just going to die, and it looked like it was going to for the first 3 months, and then it recovered, gangbusters after that. And just as an example, that's one example, of things that happen, and other things that happen, more recently, like looking at like how AI may take over the developer role, let's say. We're seeing some evidence that, we see a little bit of both ends of the spectrum, but we still see plenty of evidence that there's going to be there is the need for the human in the loop, regardless. So hopefully I won't get fooled by that. I don't know, but it could happen. It definitely could happen. But for today's world, I think that unless I've read it completely wrong, just reading what we read in the publications and our own experience as well, developing solutions, our own and those for others, there's very much a need for humans in the loop as far as software development is concerned.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned that as your truth bomb. I like to call them truth bombs. Things that people that surprise people when you say them. And so that really that AI and automation will replace the need for disciplined developers and teams. So I hear that a lot. I think that might resonate with the audience. Anything else you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, so I think there's an interesting paradigm here, Jim, with AI. And I think there's a lot you can do. And there's a lot of productivity. There's a lot of, let's say, automation you can do. I mean, even like if we look at it from a software development perspective, there's no doubt, absolutely no doubt that productivity can be enhanced, by an order of magnitude, 50%, 30 to 50% we're seeing. But on the other side of that, there's also the danger, the risk, which we've seen, that the over-reliance on using AI specifically for development will lead you off the edge of a cliff, okay? If you're not careful, if you don't put the right guardrails, the right boundaries around it. We have an example, for example, one of our lead developers was working on a software refactor for a POS system that was going to be built on the cloud on AWS, and he was leading that project. And a few months ago, he came to me and said, like, look, I'm having to integrate some code that's developed offshore. And what I'm finding is the code, while it compiles correctly and all that, there's no contextual alignment with what needs to be accomplished functionally. Okay. So yeah, the code is fine, let's say from a compilation standpoint, but it simply doesn't work. It's not fit for purpose. And, none of it is. So it's a question of, well, what do we do now? You've just instantly created technical debt. And that's the biggest issue that we're seeing is that, we internally talk a lot about technical debt and having to resolve technical debt and how AI can help with that. But you can also create massive amounts of technical debt instantly with AI if you don't put the right boundaries, the right guardrails, the right processes in place to use AI in effective ways. So in this particular case, our lead developer, he said, look, I can rewrite this faster than just going back and forth with the other team. That's a great idea, so we talked to the client about it, and the client said, yes, please do it. And, I don't know what happened to the other team, but they stopped preparing and presenting any development solutions. But anyway, that's, I think, the real danger is that you can do a lot of good things. It's a very powerful tool, but if you don't apply it correctly, with the right processes and guardrails in place, it's going to lead you astray in a big way.
That makes sense.
Potentially.
At least I think that. I mean, I guess it's when we're talking about AI, there's a lot to be proven yet, but in my mind, that makes sense. That there's still a need for humans and human verification of what AI is doing.
Right. And not only that, Jim, I think there's a question. We have another client that we're building an AI platform for, and it's a very interesting platform. He actually wants it to run his business. He wants to run his business using, like AI agents instead of hiring a staff. He has an electronics recycling business, but he's built another business which is wholly AI. And what he wants to do is just have that run with agents. And we've been developing the solution, and he quite likes it. But it's a question of the guardrails again. It's a question of the boundaries. We've created this system where he keeps adding some functionality onto it, and we try to reel him in a bit. But every time he sees something new, some new capability, it gives him the idea to add something more into it. And this is the challenge that we have as as a services team to say, okay, listen, we've got to put some boundaries on this. Let's say functional boundaries, because if not, we're running into situations where you create a set of agents to do a certain task, and then those agents they spawn other tasks or other agents that do other tasks, and you get this cascading effect of this agent creating agents type of thing. And it gets to a point where you start consuming resources to the point where it doesn't becomes like the cost effectiveness comes into question. And not only that, you run into some resource constraints, like timeouts and things like that. So we've come to an agreement with them. We'll sort of reel it in. Let's get this first version done. We've a good enough set of functionality in to make this a viable product or a viable working solution for him. And he's thinking about selling it to others as well. So we're just trying to put more of a roadmap approach onto this, as opposed to, let's say, every time we discover something new, it gives me a new idea to build more functionality. Well, where do you stop that? This is where, sometimes you get into these things and you don't know what you don't know. Okay. But when you see the capabilities and you see it come together, then, the lights keep shining. The lights go on and they stay on. And okay, can we do this? And can we do this? And yes, we can do that. But, to what extent? Where do you stop that? So that's where, we're seeing an interesting scenario in which the capabilities are vast, and so vast that you know you on the one hand you feel like, well, you don't want to put the brakes on it, but on the other hand there comes a time when you say, look, we could go on forever like this, right? And the only constraints are resource constraints, but the resources cost money, and time to market is going to get extended. So that's where we're sort of trying to say, and again, it's another boundary question. It's a different type of boundary question. The other one was more of a technical thing, technical functional or technical operations thing. This is more of like a feature functionality boundary. Like, where do you put the limits, given the extensive capabilities that AI offers.
Makes sense. So let's shift gears here a moment and talk about your superpower. Dennis, I'm going to connect something you shared earlier, and I think it reveals what might be part of your edge. You told me you kept or you keep handwritten journals, and you've been doing it for over a decade, something like thousands of pages. You started doing it, I think, to help you through decisions, and over time, it's become. You mentioned it became a reflection practice that drove both your personal and professional growth. Sounds like a real superpower. Would you agree? Can you expand on that? And any tips for people that might be thinking about trying to make this their superpower also?
Yeah. So thank you for bringing that up, Jim. So the biggest thing I've learned about business, about being in business, over the last 17, 18 years is how much I've, gotten to know myself. Okay. And it sounds like a, almost obvious thing, but I realized over time that, for so long I ran on autopilot. I ran on some, whatever it is, conditioned or limiting beliefs, that type of thing. And I really wanted to figure out, like where, what was triggering me? What, why did I take certain decisions? Or, what was driving me, where, sometimes it seemed like, looking at things, especially in hindsight, it was like, why did I do that? Why did I make that decision? What was driving that, because it seemed like either not a lot of thought was put into, it's easy in hindsight as 2020, but just some things that didn't even make sense to me, so I went down this path without even realizing I was going down the path of really trying to get to know myself and what my triggers were and what my motivations were and what, why I did what I did, and tried to be more self-aware about that whole process. And it just started as writing down a few affirmations, and affirmations didn't resonate with me at all. And I didn't think there was anything special about that. And I just started writing down thoughts. Okay. So like, some decisions that I made, maybe some decisions that I made that I regretted, some things that I said, some things that happened, why, what emotionally triggered me in the moment, that type of thing. So it's been, I would call it a journey of self-knowledge. Okay. That's what it is. And business itself is a journey of self-knowledge. It has been for me anyway. And the writing just helps, complement that. So really, that's what the writing has done. And I got to a point where I started, sort of branching away from writing about myself to writing about life in general, like, like my observations of life, outside of me, it's like, so a lot of it is inside of me, that I just sort of pen to paper. It's easy to communicate, to make that connection between your brain and your hand that, when I tried doing it, like, for example, on a word processor or whatever, it just completely failed. It's just a completely different ballgame when you do it, handwritten.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, I must have probably, I don't know, I'd say 4,000 or 5,000 pages written at this point. But,
Wow.
uh, I got to thinking that, maybe this would be something we could, turn into a book. Maybe it's something that could help some others. I mean, it's really just really reflections on life, as I see it, as I see both from within myself, from like my triggers, my emotional weaknesses or strengths or whatever encounters I've had with people, be it in business or personal struggles, financial struggles, business struggles, and how I process all of that, and how I can, get to know myself better to, sort of create a better version of me. That's really what it's all about. And I don't have a specific destination in mind for that. There's not like, oh, I've arrived at something. I don't look at it like that. I look at it as this is a journey. It doesn't necessarily have a destination. It's just a growth journey, and it's just something that, I'll just take, my lessons and try to apply them, try to reflect back on those, on, whatever it is, a decision, an emotional trigger, an encounter that didn't go well, or whatever it is, or did go well, whether it's a positive or a negative, and just look back at it and say, what did I learn from it, and how can I grow from it? And that's all it is. It's a growth journey, and as I mentioned, it has no destination. It's just, how far can you grow? How much can you learn? And you'd be surprised. At least I was surprised at how much I could do that. And like I said, there's nowhere, I think that every day there's a growth lesson, in terms of the writing, in terms of what I learn about myself, in terms of insights that just come to me spontaneously, which sometimes, like sometimes I'll just be walking down the street and some insight will come to me about something that maybe I heard on a podcast, or maybe I wrote the day before, and I say, maybe I tied this concept together with this concept, and then I write about that. So it's a constant evolution of, trying to grow and making it a journey, and not worrying about a destination.
So let's shift gears once more and talk about what's got you excited at Tangonet. I know that you've been helping companies optimize AI, implement AI, it sounds like, operationalize it. You want to talk more about that?
Yeah, so one of the examples was, the electronics recycler was built as side business, like operationalizing the solution, had to, was more a question of just putting boundaries, as I mentioned, and just saying, look, let's not make the perfect the enemy of the good, type of thing. And I think that, we've seen a few other cases, and where, we worked with another company, a startup, where, they had a very unique solution, patented solution for identifying macronutrients in prepared foods, through infrared or RGB type of photographic capture, which we turned in a processing engine to actually identify what the food was, what the volume was, and then extract the macronutrients. Very, very advanced thing. We built it on the cloud, and they were looking for a proof of concept, but again, they just kept adding. They kept seeing the capabilities. As they see the capabilities, they keep wanting to add. So the operationalization of this whole thing is really, when is good enough good enough? I mean, in terms of, looking at it from a roadmap approach, and this is what we've learned, is that, we really need to take a roadmap approach with clients and say, look, let's get to, version 0.5. Don't tell us to build a POC or an MVP, thinking about, version 5 functionality. Let's think about what's going to be good enough for now, you know?
Mhm.
And it's hard to say because you get tempted by all the functionality. You get tempted by just how powerful these models, these LLMs are. And like I said, it's been more, that's always been a challenge in our world, in our software development world, but more so now with these, powerful capabilities of the LLM. So operationalizing is a challenge of reeling it in more than anything else, putting boundaries on it and taking a very methodical approach to bringing something to life that is AI enabled.
And so, if what we're talking about here is pique somebody's attention, they'd like to learn more, what would be a good way of getting in contact with you?
Any by email is the best thing, Jim. Bruce at tangonetsolutions.com. I think you have my contact information. Feel free to share that with anybody who has any interest in those things. Whether it's the personal side of things through the journaling, or whether it's the business side through the technology services or AI. We're constantly consuming AI, ourselves for our own personal use. We're also being very, we also have a very, sharp eye out on what's happening in the industry. We're just reading, all of our team is reading, several articles per week just to see what other people are doing, what their experiences are. And we're seeing a lot of common threads with our own. And that's why, I get around this boundary thing, how can we place better boundaries, whether you're developing the solution, whether it's the developmental side and the human in the loop and all that sort of thing, or whether it is, how do you build, how do you create these new roadmaps given the extensive functionality that the LLMs offer. So happy to share any of that with anybody that wants to talk about it. And yeah, they can reach me by email or by LinkedIn. I think you have that as well.
Yeah,
Happy to connect.
we'll share those in the show notes, so check the show notes for that information.
Yeah.
And well, that's a wrap of another episode of Profits of IT. Dennis, this was one of the very thoughtful conversation, and I appreciate the depth you brought today.
My pleasure, Jim.
And before we sign off, if you're an IT company owner and tired of inconsistent leads, unpredictable revenue, and marketing that doesn't deliver, check out ManageProspectingSystem.com. I'm Jim Punzenberger, the guy that built the system, and I've been in your shoes. I've owned an IT company, and now I'm here to help you grow. Once again, that's ManageProspectingSystem.com. And until next time, stay hydrated and caffeinated. Bye for now.
Thanks, Jim.